Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. And if you've been reading the news and not living under a rock, you may well think that it's a tough time for American alliances from Canada to Europe and beyond. But the thing about alliances is that their roots are deeper than your average relationship. And so it is with the US Australia alliance, which has decades of shared history and roots that are, in fact, deeper than pretty much any other American alliance I can think of. So the current moment may turn out to be a summer squall or something a hell of a lot bigger, but it's important to perpetually refresh alliances in any case, to recommit to their purpose and to deepen their roots. And that's what we're all here to do. So by way of background, last year, we at Carnegie launched a comprehensive review of the defense-related aspects of the US-Australia alliance, with chapters on strategy, force posture, technology and innovation, alliance roles and missions, and coalition building. And I'm joined today by all but one of our authors. We've got Matt Sussex, Courtney Stewart, Stefan Fruling, Stacey Pettyjohn, and Peter Tesch. Missing only Jennifer Jackett, who's gone into the Australian government service and can't be with us. What I'm going to do is a round robin with them. We'll have a little bit of crosstalk among ourselves, and then we'll try and leave as much time as we can to take some questions from the audience. But from my vantage point, as the curator and editor of this volume and a longtime participant, both when I was in government and out of government in strategic interactions between the US and Australia, I'll give you two pieces of good news at the top. First, we have a storied history of sending our forces into combat and then fighting shoulder to shoulder, beginning, as the historians among you will know, in 1918 with the Battle of Hamel, where US forces actually served under an Australian commander. Many Americans don't know that, General Sir John Monash. Second, this alliance happens to be completely bipartisan on both sides. In Australia, the Labor Party claims it by hearkening back to Prime Minister John Curtin's December 1941 declaration that Australia looks to America. And the Liberals and Nationals can claim it because a decade later, it was Robert Menzies who signed the ANZUS Treaty. And on the American side, there's been broad and deep bipartisan support for decades. And if I may say so, especially today on both sides of the aisle in Congress. But, and this is designed to set up our conversation, there's also some tougher news. For one, our forces have fought together in the field, but we don't have as much history divvying up roles and missions. And those two things are not the same. And so they risk creating some expectation gaps that we've tried to address in this volume. There's another piece of tougher news, which is our strategic preferences are closely aligned, but they're not identical, despite what some people in Washington seem to think. The US is very focused on integrating Australian forces into American war plans, but as Matt and Peter say in their chapter, and I hope we're going to talk about, no government in Australia is going to outsource sovereign choices about war and deployments to the United States. So a lot of people seem to think that if you shout China, China very, very loudly, it will overcome these operational issues automatically with a Harry Potter-like magic wand. But we're here to tell you, and if you read the volume, you will see that that's not enough. It takes work to build coordinated strategy, posture, roles, missions, and plans. And that's what we've done in this volume with a lot of prescription. So we're not focused on rah-rahing the relationship, where the mateship is pretty self-evident when you get American and Australian warfighters together, but deterrence and defense require a lot of introspection and prescription. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each of our authors who's joined us, starting with Matt Sussex, and then Peter Tesch, his co-author, if Peter's Wi-Fi is working well from rural Australia. And they're going to talk a little bit about how to align our respective defense strategies for better effect. I hope everybody in the audience reads the volume. Matt, you and Peter kick us off with a few minutes on strategy, and then we'll work our way through the team. Matt, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, excellent. Many thanks, Evan. I'm just checking that everybody can hear me. Yeah, that seems to be working okay. Cool. Yeah, look, I just wanted to echo what Evan was saying about the the sort of ties that bind being more enduring than just one particular few years in history. It's certainly the case that as the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, now of course Australia's ambassador in Washington DC, frantically trying to make sure that the current administration is alive to issues relating to AUKUS. Apparently doing quite well, with the exception that when the president was asked about AUKUS the other day, he said, "What's that?" But there's certainly good knowledge of it at other levels of the administration. No, Rudd referred to the US-Australia security partnership as the bedrock of our strategic policy, and I think that's right, and continues to be so. But also, as Evan says, those bedrocks, while they might frame and define what you do, it doesn't necessarily mean that it shapes every single decision and every single action. So in this chapter, what Peter and I wanted to do was to have a look a little bit more at, a little bit more deeply at some of those practical aspects relating to strategy that might need some attention, and generally speaking, looking at themes of where is it that we are converging and where potentially is it that we're diverging, because that's equally important too and needs to be addressed. So the first kind of finding that we had out of this was that in trying to better enmesh American and Australian defence strategies, it has to be, I think, acknowledged from the get-go that we do have slightly different on a variety of things, slightly different interests, slightly different threat perceptions, and certainly, obviously, quite significantly different capabilities. Now, it doesn't mean they're not closely aligned. They are, and we are moving towards integration and so forth. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're identical. So. I think the main takeaway from the first bit of the analysis is that Australia's support for future American-led combat operations shouldn't be assumed, shouldn't be automatically assumed. That they're actually going to have to make the case that this is something that's in Australia's national interests, whether that are contingencies over, say, Taiwan, or whether it's something else. Australian capabilities will really only be used, I think, if there's an absolute and obvious vital Australian interest at stake, rather than simply performing alliance maintenance or alliance loyalty functions, as perhaps some operations might be sort of characterised that happened in the past. So moving from that, the second thing we talked about in our paper. And with that sort of caveat about not assuming that Australia will always be there necessarily, we thought that the best way to help synergize Australian and US defence strategies within a regional context was to focus on effects. What effect are you trying to generate? And this mirrors, I think, a fair bit of what the thinking has been in parts of the Australian defence community and the Australian strategic policy community, that it's not necessarily the case that Australia can produce, we're not a great power, maximal deterrence in a sort of, both in crisis phases and in non-crisis phases. But what we can seek to engender are certain particular types of deterrence effects. And so we look at that in some detail, with sort of cleaving the sort of tasks for Australian and American policymakers into three buckets, I suppose. We look at resources, we look at relationships, and we look at resilience. Now, that's nicely alliterative, but it I think goes to the crux of the three areas where there might be potential divergence. So what types of capabilities do you have and do you not have? You might need to acquire. What types of relationships do you have? What are your networks like? Where are you better off in terms of being able to advocate for a particular alliance relationship as being beneficial for the region? Where might you be a little bit more shaky, and how can you build sort of resilience within the relationship? And I think that having a focus like that helps us to sort of sharpen the types of opportunities that might facilitate regional military security cooperation that goes beyond the alliance. That isn't just simply a hub and a spoke, but includes things like, spoke to spoke cooperation using the old San Francisco system lingo. And how can then you reach out not just to the low-hanging fruit, other US treaty allies within the region, but countries that might be considered like-minded, friends and partners, and so on. And I think by doing that, you can enhance both deterrence as well as supporting a sense of strategic stability. So I commend that chapter to you. I think I've rattled on long enough. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Peter's about to come back on because he's got somewhat unstable internet.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give this.
Whether you can hear me.
Yeah, Peter. All right. Peter, Matt was asking
Can you hear me?
We can. Matt was asking whether you want to add anything, but I'm also wondering if you can pull the thread on this term you guys use in the chapter about aligning for effect. Talk a little bit about what you mean by effect and where you see the opportunities for greater alignment.
Okay, well, yeah, look, thank you. I think the key issue here is that third element that Matt has illuminated, namely resilience. And we set out in the paper a number of points, and he's touched on some of those. I think one of the great evolutions that I've observed in Australian defence and national security, and indeed foreign policy, is a shift in focus away from grand strategies to what is it we're seeking to achieve? What impact are we trying to have? Is it deterrence? Is it denial? Is it shaping? And therefore, I think we need to bring that lens set much more sharply to bear upon our collaboration with the United States in order to see a greater mutually reinforcing effect that we have in our respective interactions in the region. And this, of course, is at this time some doubt and uncertainty given the flux and the turbulence that we're seeing emanating from Washington, D.C. at the moment. So I think what we need is to recognise that no single nation is going to be able to achieve a desired effect, and we need to become a lot better at not just having the US and what in the eyes of many in the region is the sub-branch office Australia out there chattering away in our immediate region. So from that perspective, I think we can look at much more effectively engaging and trying to integrate our strategies and our actions with similarly minded, if not precisely like-minded partners in the region, particularly countries like Vietnam, particularly countries that are much more vulnerable to the effects of would-be hegemons, and that includes selected members of ASEAN. Obviously, Indonesia remains a challenge for all of us because of its very stalwart policy, but I think there is a need for us in Australia and for the United States as well to focus much more on what we need to do with Indonesia, particularly because if we start to see tensions heightening and the prospects of military or near military activity, access over flight basing becomes absolutely critical. And we can't just whistle those up when we need them. And to achieve those, we need greater investment across all of the domains and across many of the agencies and areas, not just grey hulls and grey tails. So there needs to be, I think, a much more integrated view coming out of Washington as well. And the most recent decisions around USAID and similar moves by the Trump administration augur very badly for being able to bring all of the instruments of influence and power that the US commands to bear upon this issue.
And before I go to Stefan, do you guys feel like the political climate in Australia, let's put the United States to the side and come back to that, especially because you're in an election year, do you feel like the political climate in Australia is conducive to that kind of strategic conversation? But also whether the processes like the Defense Strategic Review that have been done have brought us far enough toward that point. What does the next government have to do no matter who wins the election? That's for either one of you.
I lost a bit of your sound there, so I might let Matt step into the gap. But just picking up on where you landed when you came back on audio, for me at least, I think the thing that in country is there is broadly bipartisan agreement about the nature of the strategic environment and what is degrading, and we still insist on playing politics around defence and national security, recognising, as a former defence minister said once in my presence, the great thing about being Minister for Defence is you get to implement and apologise for the decisions of your predecessors. But I think broadly is a sense that we do need to adopt this sort of approach. But the big difference, of course, is evident in the pronounced emphasis the Labor government makes upon stabilising relationship with China, which is often, I think, misinterpreted as kowtowing to China. But I think certainly we are going to have some difficulties in practical terms because all of the polling would suggest that we're not going to have a compelling majority government of either flavour in Australia after the upcoming federal election, and that will mean nuance and picking arguments and political fights domestically, and I think that will create some risk that others will see opportunity to exploit. Matt?
Yeah, look, I think that covers that pretty well. I mean, it's interesting that we are in this sort of holding pattern before an actual election, but active campaigning has already begun, and we've already seen bits of sort of national security and defence become politicised within that process. And a good example was the recent Chinese flotilla, which has been circumnavigating Australia after holding some live fire drills off the coast of Sydney. There is keen appetite within the current government to make sure that it is not seen as being weak on defence and security, and equally keen appetite on behalf of the opposition to ensure that the current government is seen as weak. But the question is, of course, what you actually do about it, and that's more of a capability question than anything else. And I think it's interesting to see that with various proposals that have been put forward from both sides of politics as to what you would do with this. Labor talking about sort of more long-range fires, the coalition talking about more F-35s, is that the root cause of the problem still is something that has quite enduring bipartisan support for or mutual understanding. It's just the detail and how you get there. The one thing I'd add actually that Peter mentioned, and I think was worthwhile, was around also that this thinking, it would be very helpful if it did permeate in Washington as well, because one of the things that we didn't see as a result of the Chinese doing live fire drills off the coast of Sydney in the Tasman Sea, which they have every right to be, there if they want to, but every point to be if they want to send a message, not just to Australia, but also to test out how attentive the new administration in the White House is, and the fact that whereas I think previous administrations probably would have jumped on this quite quickly, we had relative silence from DC and from Indo-Pacific. And that's something that I think has probably raised a few eyebrows in Canberra. So there is not just that issue of how you align for effect, but also how you get your messaging right and how you ensure that you are both basically on brand when it comes to calling out bad behavior within the region.
Yeah, that makes sense. Stefan, I want to go to you next because you wrote on force posture, which I always think is the underrated star of the alliance. And there have been all these exciting force posture initiatives over the last few years. So there's the Marines in Darwin, there's Submarine Rotational Force West, and everybody, Stacey will confirm this, when you're sitting on this side of the Pacific, everybody's always talking about AUKUS. It's AUKUS Pillar 2, technology sharing, but because the timelines on a lot of that are long, if you're thinking about the requisites of deterrence, actually, in a lot of ways, it's the force posture initiative that'll have the greater impact in the short to medium term on the deterrence challenges that we face. And it doesn't get enough attention, which is why I'm glad you did the chapter. So what you argue, of course, is that you're very careful. You said that the debate in Australia has moved to a place where people are less reluctant to think about American forces operating from Australia, but less reluctant is somewhat careful. And then you have a lot prescriptive to say about where we go from here. So I want to give you a chance to dig in on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thanks for having me. And I think that I mean, if you look at alliances and the way that they cooperate, there's a lot of history, political identity, strategic kind of and strategic circumstances that lead different alliances to have very different, if you like, political, military, strategic models of what actually is the logic of that integration. And I mean, NATO, obviously, a very integrated alliance. If you look at, Korea, traditionally fairly hierarchical alliance. Japan, like functional division of labor, that sword shield arrangement. And in the Australia-US alliance, we have none of that. I mean, essentially the model for how the alliance operates at that level is has traditionally been geographic separation. Australia looks after our patch, the US looks after the rest of the world. And I think that has very deep roots in Australia's thinking. I think also very deep roots in American thinking, in the sense that America hasn't paid a lot of attention to what's happening in Australia's immediate region. And I think that's where a lot of the kind of like progress that we've seen over the last few years in US force posture initiatives in Australia, as I lay out in the chapter, are more attributable to kind of like political circumstances being a bit more amenable to the Australians not immediately saying no, than to a shared kind of like concept that actually explains the logic of how Australia's and US efforts in this alliance and in this region in particular actually articulate. And I think that, I mean, if you look at the current Australian National Defence Strategy, you'll see kind of greater emphasis on deterrence. But that is completely framed in a very local view of deterrence by denial in our own approaches. It doesn't articulate into a broader concept of multilateral deterrence. It doesn't, on the face of it, it may seem like a short sword shield model, and in the sense that Australia focuses on the defense of Australia so that the US can use Australia for longer range operations. But that's not how it is articulated, and I don't think that that's how it is conceived. And it does mean that a lot of the practical touch points of how these two postures might actually overlap and relate to each other don't receive a lot of attention, and there's certainly no policy guidance in the Australian case on those. So I think that when we go forward, we need to think about when we think about what does success look like in US-Australia force posture activity, we shouldn't look just to the extent to which American presence in Australia is ramping up. But in many ways, we need to look at to what extent do we achieve a more closer alignment of national postures in our own region, and a closer, more explicit articulation of how American and Australian efforts in Australia's own region relate to each other. And I think related to that is we need to think more about about horizontal escalation as an element of deterrence in the alliance, rather than vertical escalation in terms of ramping up American long-range strikes from here. And that means to make both horizontal escalation in terms of leveraging our alliance cooperation to bring in additional countries into a broader coalition, but also, and I think the Chinese SAC deployment is a good example here, how do we manage potential Chinese horizontal escalation into our region? And I think that, I mean, as I lay out in the chapter, that leads you to kind of like certain practical questions that I think are worthwhile looking at. I mean, for example, Australia is now paying a lot more attention to how do we operate, in particular with our army in the islands to our north. I mean, this concept of littoral operations, pushing our army into the islands. But in many ways, I mean, the strategic relevance of those islands is largely because they sit alongside, the key US logistics routes that you would have to use to resupply or to supply large American deployments to Australia. And so I think that there is a very practical element that our army, who would have to operate in those regions, if one of their main tasks is local force protection for American convoys, there are a lot of practical questions that are just not on people's radar, that also go to the question as to at what point might you deploy in a crisis, and broader issues like that. It also means that we need to think about how do New Zealand and France fit into that broader kind of like challenge. There's issues about kind of like the security of Australia's RIA bases. I mean, there's parallels there, I think, with thinking about cruise missile defense of the North American continent, cruise missile defense of Australia's southeast and southwest, and the SAC deployment, I think, was a very useful wake-up call there. But it's also shown that, I mean, if you look at the cooperation between the New Zealand Navy and the Australian Navy, and the reported delays of 40 minutes by the time that Australia found out that these from the New Zealand vessel reportedly that the live fire exercises have started, that there's some serious questions there about C2 arrangements in the Australian-New Zealand context, about how we would actually handle that in a crisis, that I think, I mean, we need to address, where obviously the US has stakes and also a need to be involved in. There are other, I mean, going more broadly to that question of how do we leverage alliance cooperation to bring in additional countries. I mean, at least until recently, European countries have been on a very steep curve to increase their kind of presence in the Indo-Pacific for signaling. And I mean, a lot of that also involves Australia. I think that, I mean, as European defense industry is ramping up, they will play an increasingly important role, including for deterrence, and certainly if we're looking at a long conflict. And so I think there's a shared interest in like fostering and enabling European countries to signal their interest in what's happening in a major conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And I think Australia has a key role to play there as a partner that can bring Europeans along, and also for practical reasons. So I think, I mean, one of the points that I put out in my chapters, I mean, thinking about developing a tanker bridge between Europe and Australia as one of the upcoming exercises could be a way of leveraging existing cooperation into ways that is operationally relevant, but that also have broader political strategic significance of moving European thinking from if you like peacetime deployments into what might be their role and interest be in a crisis. And so I think that again, thinking more about the practical implications of how does an American posture that's ramping up in our own region articulate with the actual role that Australian forces will play, and in a way that kind of like aligns with the very deep historical and political identity kind of like aspects that underpin Australia's thinking about our own defense role, and this concept of self-reliance, I think is increasingly important. So I hope that the chapter has kind of like put out some of those ideas there that may still have some practical relevance. You're mute.
I was going to say, you set up Stacy's paper perfectly. So Courtney, I know I said I was going to go to you next, but with your indulgence, I'm going to go to Stacy because you just teased this idea of divvying up alliance roles and missions and finding the right division of labor. So, Stacy, what's interesting about your chapter is that you don't look at that just in the abstract and how you get the inputs now necessary to think about scenario planning and operations for later, but you actually pull the thread on some scenarios. So there's the big Taiwan scenario, there's the second Thomas Shoal scenario, and then there's a Coral Sea scenario. And on that, then you work backwards to think a little bit about the kinds of modular inputs that are needed. So I'm going to give you a chance to pull those threads a little bit with an eye to this idea that we're going to face this issue of a division of labor within the alliance, and we need to optimize for that now.
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks, Evan. So my paper was really born out of the last administration in the United States defense strategy, which was integrated deterrence. And Becca Wasser and I had a CNAS report, OI and team, that advocated for thinking about integration more holistically. So we always consider or sort of equate frequently in the defense realm integration with interoperability. But that's a really tactical thing. We argued you needed to move up and think about institutional integration, which includes things like the defense industrial base and different planning processes, and then strategic integration. And strategic integration, in the way that we argued, did not equate with perfect alignment of interest, because we know that does not exist. but it was deemed to be necessary to more effectively guide our other forms of military cooperation and activities so that they could best meet our shared interests. So that meant sort of revealing the areas of convergence and divergence in our strategy and what we really thought about doing in a concrete way. So like you said, I laid out 3 different scenarios that were dramatically different in terms of the scale of the conflict, the type, the location, and the US and Australian interests. And I did so largely because I felt like you were seeing all of this activity that was really positive in the US-Australian alliance relationship in terms of posture activities that I'd been working on since 2011 when I was at RAND and looking at the northern bases and making improvements there to AUKUS. But there wasn't any sort of real coherence to it, and that oftentimes the 2 allies were actually speaking past each other, and that even common terms like deterrence by denial elided differences in terms of what we meant and what each party sort of expected of each other. I run a lot of war games, and I cannot tell you the number of times that I've had American players, often officials within the Department of Defense, who make really pretty outlandish assumptions about access requirements or what allies will send or deploy in different scenarios, and don't really have a good understanding of the interests of that allied nation or the constraints, the political constraints, and think that through in a really careful way. So with the report, what I tried to do was identify 3 scenarios that varied in terms of who really cared about them. Australia, the most important in an existential threat, not in an existential nuclear way, but the most direct threat to the Australian homeland is some sort of future Chinese coercion in the Coral Sea. And this was my attempt to get at what I think the new Australian defense strategy is hinting at in terms of defending the northern approaches. And it's really not a conflict over a piece of territory. It's a lot more amorphous, where there are concerns that the Chinese military, and in particular the Navy and the Air Force, is going to begin operating more in those northern areas and might be engaging in harassment of Australian military aircraft, maybe harassing other fishing and engaging in their own illegal fishing and things like that. The second Thomas Shoal was just kind of an in-between in which neither party actually had super deep interest in getting directly involved. And then Taiwan's obviously been the focus of the Department of Defense since at least probably 2018. Eli Ratner called it the pacing scenario for the department, which really meant it's what the department is using to develop its force design and force structure and measuring itself against. And I think that both Canberra and Washington need to have these honest conversations where they think specifically like, no, I don't want to send forces forward into Japan or the Philippines early in a crisis as a show of force, because I need them at home in Australia to defend our own airspace. And that actually is beneficial from an alliance perspective as well. But having that context that is really specific is necessary for these conversations. And I don't expect either party would ever pre-commit to different things, but sort of understand where the boundaries are, what are the outer bounds of what's within the realm of possible, and it can therefore on their own and collectively develop more realistic plans, which should strengthen deterrence and filter down to other activities. Like you build up the bases that are potentially useful for the ADF to use to defend the northern approaches, but and then think about whether you're going to actually have American bombers operating there or not. And if you don't, it's a very different requirement in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be built. And you think through things like AUKUS. If Australia has an American Virginia-class submarine in about 4 or 5 years, that isn't necessarily going to deploy forward if there were a war over Taiwan, that it might be better used defending, patrolling the northern waters in the Indian Ocean and making sure that the PLAN remains bottled up and that, Australia is defended. So my big push was to be specific and to have really uncomfortable conversations, not because you're going to actually reach some sort of consensus, but because you can improve your understanding of what the other is thinking, and then iterate and revise your own plans so that they serve your own country's interests, and figure out collectively what it makes the most sense for you to make investments in posture, in defense industrial base investments like GUIO, the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Initiative that Australia is undertaking, and they're going to be building GMLRS, which probably isn't useful for any of the scenarios that I just discussed. It just helps you to sort of more coherently rationalize all of your defense activities and understand whether they support collective goals and shared goals or separate ones, and what you really want to make where you want to make your investments.
Before I go to Courtney, this issue about part of our objective with this project was to get Americans to think harder about this alliance. And your point about assumptions that are baked into a lot of the conversations in Washington, not reflecting either Australian realities, it actually comes out in a few chapters, starting with Matt and Peter's, but actually it threads through all of them. But also the way you put it was not having the kinds of conversations that need to be had. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to that right now as you look? I mean, we have a new administration that just took office. What assumption is the biggest howler right now that you see on the DC side?
Well, I mean, it's not clear to me that the Trump administration is really interested in looking at areas of collective gain as much as American gain and what's in it for them, despite having a focus on China. But I think the other factor that really inhibits this is that Australia is in some ways, and I don't mean this at all pejoratively, in an early stage of thinking about its own defense in a really concrete, modern, against modern threats, that they haven't had to worry about threats to the Australian homeland for quite some time. And now suddenly they're sort of beginning to engage in a planning process that is a lot more deliberate and worried about defending their homeland in a way that I think has meant that we were always talking about operating somewhere else, expeditionary operations in the Middle East that were of peripheral interest, where you didn't have the pressure and the urgency to have that pre-planning. You could, make things up as you went along and just sort of have a pickup game. And until Australia sort of becomes comfortable with what their strategy really means to them and the Australian public accepts that, I don't think, I'm trying to remember because it's been a bit of time, but I don't think the strategy directly names China as what they're trying to deter or specifies what that is. They need to sort of develop and mature that conversation within their own nation before they can bring it to the table with the U.S.
All right, Courtney, your paper is provocative and it's generated a lot of interest because it gets at this issue of third, fourth, fifth partners, but in the context of thinking about collective deterrence and specifically in your paper in the context of a combined force with other partners. Talk a little bit. I'm just going to throw that right to you and just let you talk.
Right. Excuse me. Before I completely jump into it, because it was meant to be provocative.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time thinking very deeply about effective deterrence and what that actually meant in the region and what it meant for Australia, and for all the reasons Stacey and all the others have actually outlined. Australia needs to be brought along, on the deterrence journey. It's still, I would personally say, in its infancy, in its deterrence thinking, but it needs allies like America if it is to deter, and it needs America to deter anyways. There's not a lot it's going to be able to deter independently. And so from a conceptual point of view and a sophisticated, deterrence, thinking, as well as the capability, it needs an ally like America and a partner like Japan as well. kind of bring it up. But I think before I get, like I said before, too much, I think right now is actually, I'm quite optimistic about this administration and what's possible in this region for deterrence. If you look at Bridge Colby's nomination hearing, which I think was just a few days ago in the US, he's the author of the 2018 US National Defense Strategy. And in that, he makes a really big, but he was the author of the 2018 US National Defense Strategy. He's coming back right now. We're just waiting for the confirmation hearing, I think, result. But he'll be the number 3 in the Pentagon. He'll be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. So if you look at his 2018 National Defense Strategy, if you look at the 2021 book, Strategy of Denial, if you look at his written remarks from the committee hearing, I think we should see the Pentagon will lean in quite a lot, asking allies, just like NATO, spend more and do more. And that means not just get more capabilities, but take on a more leadership role. But for Australia, what does that mean? It can raise, the 2.1 or 2.2 to 2.4% of GDP for defense, but what are we buying and what are we going to get for our money? And I think until we have some sort of combined coordination mechanism, some sort of institutionalized mechanism to discuss and to actually operationalize deterrence, it's always going to be completely ineffective from my perspective. It's always going to be, it's not going to be effective. It's not going to deter China because it's not going to have the time, the readiness. It's not going to have the coordination amongst the political elites. The interoperability is not going to be there between the human factor, the procedural factors, the technical factors. We're always going to be behind. That's not credible. That's not effective in my point of view. And so if you were able to create some sort of mechanism, and people have said, oh, we need an Asian NATO. I think that's never going to happen. But I think if you created a combined joint force, that would be the sort of the workaround that people could have the appetite to consider. That wouldn't be a brand new force. That would be forces that could be training together, that could be planning together, that could be working towards interoperability together, a place and to actually have these hard conversations that Stacey's mentioning and get on the same page and be really clear about who's willing to show up for what, and then actually form those task groups. You could have them on MISO, you could have them on deterring threats to critical infrastructure. You could have them on whatever the issues are that mattered to the countries in this region. I could be talking about this for a lot longer, but the idea is to create a brand new mechanism, a joint combined deterrence force headquartered out of Indo-PACOM. And yeah, that was kind of my big idea.
Could I just ask Peter or the others, because you've read Courtney's chapter, I'm just curious what the appetite is in Australia to think through that. I'm thinking about this probably because we published this Alliance Review in 2024. Some of you may not remember this. I worked on one in 1999 at the Kennedy School that was co-chaired by Paul Dibb and Bob Blackwell. And one of the recommendations that came out of that volume was more coordinated U.S., but the U.S. had these bilateral alliances in the region, 5 alliances. And so the recommendation from most of that task force was for more coordinated alliances. And to anybody who remembers that volume, there was a furious reaction from at least one and maybe a couple of folks on the Australian side saying this is the worst idea we've ever heard ever. And so the Australian debate has now moved quite a bit over 25 years. But when I pull it up to what Courtney's talking about, which is kind of expeditionary combined forces for deterrence and then potentially for operations, I'm just curious how far, what's the state of the appetite in Australia for that now, in your judgment?
I'm happy to jump in there. And I mean, I think Courtney is right. I mean, we need to build more integrated forces that allow us to, in particular, though, I would say for signaling. I mean, I think there's a great need for us, I think, to be able to operate, for example, in the South China Sea in support of the Philippines, wherever, China may be pressing at one point, and we may actually want to send signals through the deployment of military force. These parallel, loosely coordinated national signaling efforts that we have in our region at the moment just don't cut the mustard, I think, in particular if crises kind of like escalate. But that's a very different thing from saying that kind of like joint force that you might use for signaling actually then has, operational warfighting value. Because I think and this connects what Stacey is saying. I mean, Australia, I think, was very naive about what we can achieve in a major conflict, and I think that is still a bit there. I mean, we're 25 million people on a continent the size of the continental US, all of which coasts are, ultimately vulnerable now. So the ability for us to deploy forces even into Australia's north, which I think is a very great focus of the national defense strategy, there's a lot of things that we need to do to defend our rear areas before we can think of, pushing forces north. And I think that's kind of like where greater integration is necessary. And I think that, if you look at C2 and how do we actually keep the sea lines free, we need to think back to the last time we dealt with this is the Second World War. It's the First World War and the Second World War. The first few months, the main thing that the Australian Navy did is, clear the seas in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific of German raiders. And that's exactly the same thing that we're going to have to do again before we can think about sending anybody anywhere. That's very kind of like not very glamorous, pretty prosaic, but it needs to be done and it needs to be prepared for. And I think that, again, those kinds of issues are things that putting those things on the table for Australia would actually help advance our debate and focus minds. And I think that whether that's a joint command structure, you probably wouldn't have to do that with joint forces, but it needs more attention to those very unglamorous practical issues. And going back to the Second World War, we've had Chinese. Japanese submarine and air attacks on or air surveillance of Sydney. Australia doesn't really like to think too much that a lot of part of our Navy or JSF are going to fly caps over Sydney and other places like that. But that's going to be the reality that we need to kind of accept and work around.
Evan, can I jump in? I'm sorry.
Please. Yeah.
I know not offering an Australian perspective, decidedly an American one here. I do think that this could be very helpful from a deterrence signaling perspective, but you're already seeing bits and pieces of this, like with AUKUS, with the submarines. Australians are going to be on American Virginia-class submarines as they're learning how to operate and maintain the boats. And, there have been questions raised about what happens if a balloon goes up and that submarine is deployed to go into the Taiwan Strait and sink ships. I'm afraid that sometimes the type of operational integration that Courtney is talking about doesn't mean that you actually have the harder strategic and policy conversations at the higher level. I've been in a lot of war games with different allies and partners, often normally in separate rooms, and where what the Americans will say, even to those where we have combined headquarters, is very, very different. And sometimes just creating the operational force, it does signal something, but it doesn't mean you've actually figured out what you want to do with it or what you won't do with it. And it can create the appearance of more alignment than there is, which might be, that could be the whole point of deterrence, but I don't think it necessarily will result in strengthening it either.
Just very quickly, if I can, on hard conversations, I think that, if you are going to do a sort of fully integrated combined force like this, there are some roadblocks in the Australian context in terms of how Australians think about future war and future contingencies versus how the United States thinks about future contingencies. Put very, very crudely, and this is by no means comprehensive, but it does seem that the predominant American view of future war will be high tempo, high intensity, fought on the high seas. Whereas from an Australian context, future war is thought of much more as something that might be sub-threshold, something that might grow through things like civil military fusion fleets or harassment within the region in a littoral context, green water and so forth. So now there is those different emphases, I think, on what future battles will look like. And perhaps, in fact, part of that conversation between Australia and the United States will focus and need to focus very much on those capabilities that Australia has, and where can we be a better ally to the United States in an actual operational context. Given the way that we're postured with AUKUS subs still a way off, maybe it makes sense for Australia to focus on that sort of more low end aspect of things, and designate combined forces or build up combined forces for that purpose. But without that kind of discussion about where those basic strategic understandings are, I think you are perhaps left with something that's only valuable for messaging rather than something that can be used.
Peter, did you want to jump in on this? I have a couple of audience questions, but I want to give you a chance.
Evan, thanks. Very briefly, and mindful that I hope you can hear me, but there's been a few sound interruptions, so I've got the gist, but I'll just make a couple of brief observations. First, I think there would be a political neuralgia about committing in any institutional way to a Jeff-type model because of the perception that would bind us irrevocably, and the costs of potentially saying, actually, maybe we're going to sit this one out would be very, very high. The second is a question of scale. We're 58,000 people in uniform. And we're 27 million people, half of whom live in 3 East Coast capital cities. There are practical constraints on our industrial base, and that's why I think the ideas in Jennifer's piece are particularly pertinent, and Matt and others have talked about AUKUS. We've got building blocks there, but what we need to do is lean much more heavily into this, because the obsessive focus in Australia on nuclear-powered submarines means that, as with the tank, everyone has an opinion, and the opinion is not always well formed. AUKUS Pillar 2, I think, is really exemplary in how we can help ourselves jointly, collectively, and in a much more integrated way to create the resilience and the depth which will have deterrent effect, will be an important contribution to signalling. And we should be a lot more, I think, innovative and flexible in how and where we work with partners in the region to operationalize these effects. And there are some players who are going to be much more forward-leaning. There will be others who will be supportive in a quiet way. We've got a lot of experience there. And I think rather than always looking for the next new big thing, institutionally speaking, we should really concentrate on deepening the foundations of what we have. And I think the joint defence industrial base is absolutely fundamental, because it also gets to that question of defending the rear that Stefan was talking about, as we see more and more US assets dispersed across the region, and in particular into Australia. A couple of comments, over to you.
Yeah, so to do a combined force, you'd need to have the right package of relationships with third and fourth parties. And so I want you guys, maybe Courtney, to go back to you, then to just let you all pull that thread a little bit. There's a question here from the audience. It's framed in terms of what's going on. There's a lot of rumor mongering now about Five Eyes, and it's Canada, stuff in the media. But the question is really about how to better develop that set of partnerships with third and fourth parties. Japan springs to mind in particular, but not just Japan. Peter teased Indonesia. There's kind of India out in the background as a growing maritime player. Can you, Courtney, I want to go back to you so you can respond to anything, but also anybody that wants to jump in on this question of how you assess the state of those third, fourth, fifth, sixth party offshore relationships, whether in the defense domain or in the logistics or intelligence domain, and then what's not being done that needs to be done. I want to give you all a chance to jump in on that. Courtney, why don't I start with you?
Thanks, Evan. Just to get to Peter's point about not creating anything new, I would say the train has already left the station. And if you look at how I set up my paper, I went into detail about what the US and Australia are already doing in this space, and what Australia is doing with Japan in this space, and what the US is doing with Japan in this space, and then what all three are doing in this space. So the skids are already greased in this regard. From what I'm already seeing, the work's already happening. We're looking at getting Japanese rotational forces at Darwin. These things are already happening. In terms of other third and fourth parties, what I love about the idea of, let's say, the GEF or the CMF is that this is a build your own adventure on what matters in this region. I think there's alignment already about what we see as common. We want to deter threats to our sovereignty, threats to, territorial integrity, to our critical infrastructure, to our supply lines, to threats to our prosperity. How do we do that? And so you can create task force that matter to us. They don't have to be a joint expeditionary force. It doesn't have to be that. That might be 10 years from now, that might be 5 years from now, but there can be smaller ones where people can start to work together to start to iron out these challenges operationally now. And the beauty of this model would be that countries like Fiji or New Zealand or Malaysia, they can add what they'd like, when they'd like, to these structures. So it's not NATO. You're not signing your forces over to a larger body. It doesn't work that way. So.
I can jump in. I mean, I do think we haven't talked about Trump much, but I do think, and I think Courtney is right. I mean, in many ways, what we see kind of like coming out of the administration in terms of the management of Indo-Pacific alliances may strengthen a lot of the points that we've talked about here. But I do think something has fundamentally changed, and that will play out over the next few years. And that's the way that we look at dependence on the US. Because we've had for years debates about to what extent can we depend on the US. But largely that was framed around the question, will the US ever lose interest, and questions about burden sharing between allies. And so in many ways, what we would need to do to strengthen the alliance, or what we would need to do in practice to kind of like prepare for a possible loss of American interest, was essentially the same, which is spending more and build up self-reliance, but in forces, but ultimately based on access to the American industrial base. And I think that whatever is going to happen in terms of the engagement of US allies in the Indo-Pacific, now when we have those conversations, we can't ignore the question anymore. If we are faced not with a US that is looking for more burden sharing or loss of interest, but a US that is actually actively hostile to its allies. And I think that what's going on with Canada, what's going on with the UK, with Ukraine, it's as fanciful as it might seem, those questions will now come up, and that will have consequences, I think, for the way that we reassess the risks of integrating even in the defense industrial base. How much of that will actually, have practical consequences remains to be seen, and I think that will play out over the next few years. But I do think that we need to be aware that the political and policy debates, can't ignore that question of not just dealing with the worst case being in America that looks to allies carry more of the burden and gracefully bows out, but in America that may actually be actively hostile. And I think that sounds fanciful in our region, but I think the politics there and the realities have changed, and that will have impacts for the way that Australia reassesses a lot of these risks and benefits of future alliance cooperation.
I'm glad you said in our region, because that European conversation doesn't seem to have come hasn't migrated west yet. And in fact,
but it doesn't mean that. Before 2 months ago, we wouldn't have had, if you raised those issues, it wouldn't have had much traction. It's not as easy to dismiss now anymore.
No, sure, but Pete Hegseth's first meeting, I think, with a foreign minister was with Richard Marles, if I'm not mistaken. So, a lot of the right things were said, and at least the optics of it are a little different, at least at this point, than they are in Europe. Peter, I think we're going to lose you. I'm going to run 5 minutes over with the others, but if we are going to lose you, I want to thank you for joining us, and look forward to encores with you. We're going to launch this thing in Australia in a few weeks. So thanks, Peter. I just wanted to pull the thread with just 5 minutes. Well, there's one more audience question, so I want to be respectful of the audience. And then I want to do just one quick round robin where you each kind of give your, top piece of advice, particularly to the Trump team. If you were them, how would you recommend they be thinking about Australia? Because they may not be yet preoccupied as they are. But Stacey, there's a question from Lachlan McGovern just about Chinese coercion in the South China Sea and in the Coral Sea, and specifically because those are your scenarios. So he just asked, how do we raise the costs to change the Chinese calculus? And I think what's implicit in that question is jointly.
I mean, that's a hard question. You have to be willing to run the risks if you're going to raise the cost jointly. And the argument that I made in the paper, and that I think I stand by, is that the country that is best positioned to respond to Chinese coercion is the one that is proximate to it and that has the greatest interest. So that would be the Philippines for the South China Sea, and then Australia in the Coral Sea. And that doesn't mean that other partners and allies might not backstop you, but I think the persistent nature of the gray zone type of coercion that China engages in means that you really need to have a more continuous presence, and that doesn't really lend itself to being a combined operation. And if you're going to undertake that, you have to be willing to undertake the risks associated with it. Like if the US were to start resupplying the Sierra Madre, or actually stationing forces on it, which some people have advocated for. That being said, there are lots of things that already happen. My understanding is, the US Marines in Darwin sometimes transit to the east to Queensland to go do some exercises on Australian amphibious ships. I wouldn't stop those type of activities. You might want to have them more often, but I don't think that's your primary way of responding to it, because you need to have a more frequent response, and that's going to rely on the forces that are closest.
Okay. Can I just to close us out, can I just do that quick round robin? I mean, you're free. I mean, it's an election year in Australia too, so you're free to give a recommendation to the Australian side about either how they need to think this through given the new dispensation over here. But I'm particularly thinking about the American side, because that was part of our objective, was to deepen the thinking about this particular bilateral alliance on this side of the Pacific. Just give, no less than one, but maybe no more than two recommendations as we, as the people come into place. We're going to think a little bit harder about it. What are we not doing that we need to be doing? If you were writing the post-Marles Hegseth memo, Courtney, Stacy, what's the priority action item? Courtney, why don't I start with you?
I just keep thinking about expectations. I'd also, I'd love to hear what the expectations are from a U.S. perspective. What role do they expect Australia to play? What does it mean specifically to step up from a leadership perspective in this region? More clarity is needed. And what they're getting so far is spend more, but that's not on what? There's a lot of competing challenges in Australia. As you say, it is an election year, and asking for more money after Australia just made a very large investment in the submarines. I think, the check cleared for $500 million. Is that how much it was? I think it was $500 million. But what else should be bought? There's limited opportunities here to buy big capabilities, because they're going to be competing against the social requirements here, the Medicare and pensions and all the social programs that Australians love and don't want to lose. That's going to be big in this election. And inflation, just like in the US, has hit Australia hard. So I think it's going to be really hard to spend more on defense without being very clear about on what and what we're all working towards.
And if I'm not mistaken, since you alluded to Bridges' confirmation hearing, I think he said 3%. I'm referring to the hearing yesterday. So, so that's a political football too. Stefan?
Yeah, look, I think that there's going to need to be, the US needs to find a way of bringing allies into a joint conversation about planning, and to some extent C2. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot that Australia could kind of contribute and probably contribute better. There's a lot of, as Stacey said, there's a lot of unspoken or explicit assumptions that have never really been tested. And we need to find those assumptions will only really be tested if there is an honest conversation about what countries would be willing to do, what their relative priorities would be. And that needs political cover. And I think that a conversation that is framed around, we have a war plan, we will show you a small little part that we expect you to do, is not going to get you the political cover to kind of like enter into those kinds of conversations. So I think thinking through the political military level as to the framework through which you have conversations about who does what, and also to some extent accepting that might include, a certain US entering into dependencies, that if you expect the Australians to take care of, let's say, protection of shipping into Australia or so, that creates dependencies on the part of the US that need to be managed. I think that those kinds of recalibrating the political military approaches and recalibrating the level of dependence that comes with greater reliance and greater allies stepping up, I think that's where, more so than even practical preparations, the important choices need to be made.
Great. Stacey.
I wholeheartedly agree with Stefan and Courtney, as that's what my chapter wrote about. But I would also say that I think the Trump administration in particular needs to remember that this is a two-way street. And if you really want to, strengthen resiliency, wean supply chains off of China for some things, and create sort of your greater combined strength, that they need to probably abandon a little bit of the America First approach all the time. If you have allies that are contributing more, they also are going to need to see some benefits. And in particular, in the industrial base area, you're going to have to see, it doesn't make sense, I don't think, to just say buy American, because American companies can't produce enough of it. So we need to build up more industry that creates more redundancy and resiliency for everyone.
Okay. Matt, bring us home.
Yeah, I'll be blunter, and perhaps more in the more immediate term. It's I think there is a clear need for the US administration to articulate how specifically it proposes to contribute to strategic stability within the Indo-Pacific space. Because this is going to be especially important if you want to bring third and fourth order partners along. It's going to be necessary, for instance, for Indonesia to give the okay to allow overflight and transit and possibly even resupply in the event of a crisis. How are you going to convince Jakarta that doing anything other than hedging and effectively remaining neutral is actually in their interest and something that they should be doing? And I'd actually put it further in terms of the sort of messaging context within Australia, that there is significant alarm that the United States may end up as being largely indifferent to Australian interests when it comes to competition, strategic competition with China, and at worst, potentially even hostile to those interests. So I think very, very clear messaging on precisely what is expected of allies, precisely how the United States makes the region a more stable place. And if it doesn't, then why it is that what incentive structures there are for others to cooperate with the United States. And I think that this is something that we will really badly need within at least the next 6 months or so. Otherwise, the conversations that are already happening in Australian strategic policy circles about, okay, well, where do we hedge? Where do we diverge? And where do we potentially disengage are only going to accelerate.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing because of the demonstration effects, as we said at the beginning, of what's happening in alliances elsewhere. So that's a good charge for the administration, but it also sets the bar pretty high on both sides. I want to thank everybody for the chapters. I want to thank everybody in the audience for joining us. I really recommend you read the volume. I don't know about you guys, but I think the volume's terrific. I've read lots of stuff about alliances over the last decade, particularly in Pacific Asia, and there's a lot of cheerleading, which is good because we all believe in these alliances as the bedrock of deterrence and strategy. But it's also necessary, particularly as the operational questions have gotten harder to dig in more. And these questions are really thorny, as we were saying at the beginning. So this volume, these chapters go a long way, I think, not just to frame the issues, but also to be really quite, as I said at the beginning, prescriptive. And so it charts a course that the governments can follow or not follow, but it certainly has an action agenda where we don't just admire the problem, but we actually think hard about what we need to do to meet the moment. We're going to do this again in Australia. We'll do it in Sydney. We'll do it in Canberra. We'll do it in Melbourne and Perth. So I'll be down there with some of you and look forward to that. In any case, I want to thank the audience for joining us. Hope you'll read the volume. It's on the Carnegie website, downloadable. And thanks again for joining us. Thanks, team. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Evan.